that. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next session, which is Collaborating to Compete, and that's going to be moderated from Patricia Feeney from Crossref. So I'll have the panelists come on up and we'll get them going.
Hi everyone, I'm Patricia Feeney from Crossref, and this is our Collaborate to Compete session. I think I bumped something. Let's see. All right. There we go, sorry about that. So scholarly communications is full of examples of competitors getting together to figure out solutions to industry-wide problems, whether it be a new standard or a new organization. I've worked at Crossref for over 10 years, and it's a good example of an initiative that was formed because competing publishers came together and saw a problem that they could solve collectively and come up with a shared approach to a common problem. Crossref is a big part of publishing infrastructure, so it's easy to forget that it began with a few publishers coming together and say, oh, this is a big problem. This is a big problem. We need to figure out how to fix it. So today we're going to hear about 3 newish collaborations between competitors, and then we'll finish it up with a discussion about new avenues for collaboration and share a collaboration checklist that we began that our panelists collaborated on. And we can take questions about the individual projects throughout the panel, and then we'll also have the discussion about collaboration in general after our panelists have finished. So first, we're going to start with a discussion of a presentation about MECA. Anna Jester from eJournal Press, the Director of Sales and Marketing, and Tony Alves, the Director of Product Management at Aries, will share how they've collaborated to create MECA, a manuscript exchange initiative.
Thank you, Patricia. So Anna and I are going to talk a little bit about the Manuscript Exchange Common Approach project. And so the Manuscript Exchange Common Approach, also called MECA or MECA, it was originally started, kicked off by John Sack of Highwire, the makers of Bench Press, an online submission and peer review tracking system. And John contacted some of the other major systems, the editorial manager system developed by the company I work for, Aries, EJP, eJournal Press, that's the company that Anna works for, and Clarivate's Scholar One. So we all got together. We also invited PLOS at the time where they were developing their own system called Aperta, and we got together to try to solve a common problem that we all faced. And that problem is basically that we had a number of mutual customers that wanted to be able to move manuscripts from submission system to submission system. So we have commercial publishers, society publishers, university presses that actually use multiple submission systems. And so that, for cascading workflows, it was important that they be able to move those papers. Another problem that we understood was out there in scholarly publishing is that, or this isn't a problem, but the author is becoming a more important person in the ecosystem, and so trying to help those authors ease the burden of submitting a paper once it's been rejected from one journal, being able to move that to another journal of their choice was important, and then also reviewer frustration. So that was another big part of what we were trying to solve. So looking maybe a little bit more deeply at how is it that we collaborated. Well, one of the things that we had to do as a group, once we got together and decided that we were going to go ahead and pursue this, we decided that we needed to define 4 major use cases that we all understood and focus on those use cases, understanding that there may be other use cases in the future. So as I mentioned, being able to transfer paper from journal to journal in a cascading workflow. That was really the primary problem that we were trying to solve. And what we had been doing is actually developing individual solutions depending on what the other system was on the other end. And so we were replicating or duplicating our efforts again and again. And so we said, well, if we could just have one common way to pass data and files from system to system, that would be really, really useful. And it would allow us to devote our time to other more interesting projects, other more interesting innovations, other than trying to simply pass papers back and forth. So another use case that has emerged over the past couple of years is preprint servers. People want to be able to send papers that they've posted on a preprint server to the journal of their choice, and increasingly journals are offering to send papers that have been submitted to their journal off to a preprint server. And so that is another use case that we focused on. We all agreed that that was an important use case, and so that was established as one of the top 4. Another use case is that there has been an emergence of authoring tools out there where authors can go and get assistance in putting together their research paper. And this is something like Overleaf, Authoria. So and also some publishers are developing author portals where they're offering services to authors. And so this is another important use case. And then finally, really a secondary use case is that all of our customers work with multiple vendors, and they may be vendors that are offering editorial tools that help the editor make decisions, or they may be production tools where papers are going off to have some production services used on them. And so that was another important use case that we all agreed on. And then standardization. One of the important things that we did was we identified 7 project areas where we all cooperated, and where we then broke into groups and then discussed how we were going to address each of those project areas. So vocabulary, we established a common vocabulary among all 5 of the participants. And then we collaborated to talk about how we are going to address things like how the material gets packaged up, how we all agreed that we would use JATS XML to tag the information. We worked together to develop a common schema for the peer review information, because JATS doesn't address peer review information in its schema, and so on. So we all worked together on each of those different areas. And then in order to be sure that this would be a common approach that would be accepted by the industry and something that would be credible, we brought all of this information to NISO in order to, and submitted that as a project, and NISO accepted that as a project, and we've currently put together a working group, and we're now working with NISO to create this as a standard recommendation that could be used by anybody in the industry in order to pass manuscripts, so files and data, from one system to another in a quick and easy way. And I'd want to turn it over to Anna to finish us off.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thank you very much, Patricia, for inviting me to speak. All right. So really, we've talked about some use cases. We've talked about how we wanted it to be standardized. We happen to like best practices a lot. So really, let's talk some more about why, however, did we actually collaborate in this manner. So some journals and editors see benefits for transferring submitted manuscripts, both files and metadata, and I think of reviews as metadata, to other journals, usually, of course, because they've rejected them. So this has been happening for a long time, and organizations with multiple journals have been transferring manuscripts back and forth between themselves, sometimes also calling it cascading, for many years, and that has many workflow implications. So really, using a standard method to do this just speeds the process up. So I would just ask of all of you, if any of you would enjoy spending your day retyping the same title and abstract multiple times into various different web pages. Can you stand up right now? Like, I want to do that. Yeah, okay. So how about anyone who enjoys reformatting a manuscript to match a journal's format with absolutely no guarantee of a return on your time investment? Anybody else want to stand up and say, yep, that's me? No. Okay, well, so how about any of us have you an internet connection, perhaps at work or while you travel or at conferences, that makes uploading and downloading files feel painful to you? Anyone ever thought, you know, I just want to just re-upload my files. That's all I ever wanted today. Yeah, or get my email. And then last but not least, has anyone here ever reviewed a manuscript for a journal and thought, I hope I get to do this a second time for a different journal? Yep. So I guess so we're in agreement. Okay. So yeah, that is why, when possible, let's avoid some of those things, right? So really, it's should you collaborate? And I would say very much, knowing that a collaboration seems like a good idea, we want to be friendly, we want to be helpful, that doesn't mean every opportunity is worth pursuing. So I would just note, and we will talk about this a little bit more later, and these are some items I would include here. Consider the costs associated with collaboration and the costs associated with technology. People who agreed to host a website in 2001 probably didn't talk to you about having redundant data centers and or having redundant servers or redundant power supplies or internet connections into those servers, right? But all of us expect the internet to be available 24/7, 365. It's what we expect. And choose your team wisely. People are hugely important, possibly the most important part of a collaboration. If you put people on your team to collaborate who don't understand what you've been doing for the past number of years or have any idea about scholarly publishing, there's going to be a learning curve, and it's going to be very difficult for them to understand the implications of the choices that they're making, especially if they don't intend to stick around. And that's a whole other discussion. But so risk and your society or association or journal or editor's tolerance for risk is important to consider, and it might change over time. And you also need to consider the fact that not taking a risk could be riskier than taking a risk, right? So keep that in mind. And then, of course, timeline. So how long should this collaboration take, right? Ideally, our project plan would inform us of this information, but it turns out there may be other people who have thoughts. Are there outside forces like, say, funding agencies who are pushing a timeline? That's really going to come into play. And then last but not least, effort. I would say, what level of effort will this collaboration take? And will it be a one-time thing? Will it be constant? Will it never end? Will you wish it ended? Anyway, so all of these are factors that you should definitely contemplate when you are going to collaborate. So clearly, in this instance, it was worth all of these. So on that note, I would just say thanks for listening to us talk about collaborating.
Thank you both. Does anyone have any questions for Tony or Anna? Nope. Okay. We'll have time to ask them questions later as well. So. Oh, I'm sorry.
So, is this on? Yeah. So, well, we already have a draft of the solution, and it's already being implemented a couple of our organizations. EJP has implemented it, we've implemented it, and bioRxiv is currently implementing it as well, and I believe BenchPress has too. So it's all, but now we're going through the process with NISO to be sure that what we've done is we put together a large group of people, probably about 15 or 20 people from across commercial publishers, university presses, and society publishers to look at this solution to be sure that everybody really agrees that it's the right solution.
What will this look like? Will there be a button like within each submission system where you say which other submission system you want it to move to?
That would be really up to the submission system to decide how they want to implement it. What we've done is we've put together a recommended best practice that identifies the best way to send out the information, the metadata in the files, and the best way to receive the metadata in the files. And so it's up to each system, not just submission system, but any system that wants to use the methodology to decide how it would look. But what we've done is we've identified what does the data in the files, what does the data need to look like, and how do the files and data need to be packaged.
And so will it be one package or maybe a checklist? Like, let's say that you just want to submit the paper but not the reviews. Or is it a catch-all and it's all or nothing?
There is a minimum amount of information that needs to be sent, like the title and the author, and a few other pieces of data, but the what gets sent and what gets received is completely up to the receiving and sending organization.
So then would it be the author choosing to submit it somewhere else or possibly the society?
That would be
or
up to the organization that is sending out the information, whether they want to ask the author, which is certainly a recommendation that you should.
Okay, thank you.
I would also say it's important not just to ask the author, but if reviews are going to be sent, to have buy-in by those reviewers, especially if they're going to be identified.
Thanks.
Other questions?
All right. So next up, we have Craig Van Dyck from CLOCKSS. He's the executive director of CLOCKSS, and he's going to tell us about the founding of ORCID. He's been very involved with the founding of ORCID, and I think Crossref and a lot of organizations over the years. So he has a lot of information to share with us.
Thanks, Pat. I assume it's the page down button somewhere. Okay. So I have the feeling everybody here might already know about ORCID the way it was referred to earlier, but just to be sure, ORCID is a kind of acronym. It stands for Open Researcher and Contributor Identifier. It's like a DOI for authors. Its focus is the scholarly world, research, the academic world. I actually work for CLOCKSS, which is a preservation archive, which is a kind of collaboration itself. But today I'm going to be talking about ORCID, which, as Pat said, I was involved in its early days. So let's start with just a little bit of history. ORCID is a kind of case study about collaboration. It started with a need for the disambiguation of persons' names. Not only publishers were interested in this, but other parties in the scholarly community as well. So while publishers initiated the idea, it was clear from the beginning that this needed to include the participation of other parties besides publishers for there to be uptake. One of the early questions was, should Crossref do it? And the answer was no, partly because there were Crossref members who had their own systems, and it was felt that it would be difficult to do this within Crossref, partly for that reason. So the idea was then to form a separate organization, a not-for-profit organization, and to differentiate this from other systems that were out there, for example, Researcher ID, Scopus, ISNI, and the idea was that ORCID would not compete with those, but would be a kind of crosswalk among them. Thomson Reuters contributed base software, not all of the software of Researcher ID, but some basic software. So the founding of ORCID included a board of directors that represented the different communities, some leading publishers, secondary services, funder and research centers, universities, and library services. And I can't overemphasize the importance of getting the participation of these non-publisher parties. There was some concern in the early days that this was going to feel like something publishers were ramming down the throats of everybody else, and thus would alienate other parties. So it was important not only to have the participation of other parties like universities and funders, but to give them a lot of power within the collaboration. In the early days, there were loans, which was an important part of getting ORCID up and running. The fact is, it takes money to start up an organization and to get some staff and get out there in the world and travel around the world, et cetera. So there were over $1 million of loans, which will be paid back over time. The hiring of an executive director was, of course, an important milestone. I think ORCID was very lucky and is very lucky to have made a very successful hire. Lori Hack, who lives here in Bethesda and has been a real driver, very energetic, and knows the space very well. And another important milestone was agreeing on principles and policies. I will mention this again later, but because this was a multi-community group, the truth is that not all the groups had the same priorities. There were for-profits, there were not-for-profits, for example. And agreeing on principles and policies was an important step for the group to work through some of those issues that they might not have agreed on. And also another important thing was a business model working group. As with any organization, it needs to be sustainable. It needs to receive revenues one way or another. So the business model working group did a lot of kind of spade work looking at how that would be structured. So now, 6 years later, the board has continued to evolve. There are 6 of 14 original board members, and there are new board members, which I've listed here, which again diversifies the community, the ORCID community, to spread out the influence away from publishers. And I think today we see that that the academic community has sort of taken up ORCID to a pretty strong degree. There are also 2 researchers on the board, 2 researcher positions, which is also important. There were grants that supported the expansion, particularly to hire people around the world, which really raised the international awareness. One thing that developed over time was this idea of national consortia. One thing we learned, or I learned, others may have known this before, is that the United States is a lot less centralized than other countries. In other countries, you can go to the national government and work something out, and the country sort of falls in line. In the U.S., we don't have that kind of centralization. And universities, for example, are very proud of their differentiation. So just because Harvard and MIT do something doesn't necessarily mean that UC Berkeley and USC will do it, for example. But at this point, there are over 900 members of ORCID, which includes over 700 universities and research institutes, with a very important component being outside the United States. I just wanted to call attention to a particular paper here by Jeff Builder, Jennifer Lynn, and Cameron Nayland called Principles for Open Scholarly Infrastructure. I think it gets at some of the issues that are important to consider when talking about a collaboration in the scholarly community. So I wanted to say a few words about lessons learned, and please stop me if I'm going too long. So any collaboration has a certain amount of overhead, and we're speaking here today about collaborations outside of one's own organization. Of course, there are collaborations inside an organization, but we're talking here about collaborations among and across organizations. So there's a certain amount of overhead that comes with that. Everybody is working on a volunteer basis, which may mean that it is not their first priority. It probably means it is not their first priority. So there's a certain amount of herding the cats, et cetera. So there has to be a valuable enough win to justify that collaboration. And it has to be possible to articulate a compelling story, in this case, why ORCID should be adopted. Sometimes that story can be defensive. Maybe the collaborators feel under threat. I think in the days of Crossref, for example, that was certainly a factor, that it was the beginning of open access and publishers felt they needed to be seen to be doing something useful with digital publishing capabilities. So the compelling story can take different shapes. In the case of ORCID, it was not that easy to articulate the compelling story because it played differently to different communities, and it really tended to be about efficiency within the organizations. And different organizations have very different structures, even from university to university. So it wasn't so easy to point out to the vast universe of universities, for example, how this is going to make their operations more efficient. Someone mentioned earlier the idea of a rising tide. A rising tide lifts all boats, and I think that's certainly the case in a lot of these collaborations that organizations have participated in. It's one reason that organizations get together is that it's in mutual interest. I wanted to say a couple of words about standard with a lowercase s and standard with an uppercase s. We have Todd Carpenter here, so we have a leading expert. Different situations require different approaches. I think the upside of a formal standard is that it helps the uptake because there are some parties who don't want to buy into something unless it has the imprimatur of being anointed by a standards organization. That's sort of one track. Another track is to try to build up a best practice first before declaring something a standard. I've seen examples of people saying this is the standard and getting it approved, but nobody actually uses it. So that's not always the most successful approach. The other approach is to try to get the uptake and the usage first. I think it's important not to be competitive with other existing systems, but cooperative. That was a lesson learned here. And my last slide, if possible, build on other successful collaborations. Some people in this room have probably worked together on other collaborations, and it's a kind of virtual team that can get formed, and working together can be the basis for working together again. So I would encourage you to consider yourselves teammates when doing these collaborations. Leadership is certainly important. It can be a little bit tricky. A collaboration, everybody is sort of an equal, but in my experience, people appreciate leadership, especially if it's leadership they can buy into. So having some form of leadership who considers this mission critical It's also important to have senior management support within one's own organization so that you can spend the time on it, and also so that your own organization will actually take advantage of the output of the collaboration. It's no fun to work on a collaboration and then find out your own organization isn't interested in the output from that. Being an honest broker is important because a collaboration will include people who are not necessarily on the same page, so it's important to demonstrate being an honest broker, for example, arguing in favor of things that may be against one's own organization's interest is a way to demonstrate that. The principles and policies are a way to create transparency to reassure doubters. And finally, sustainability is always important. It needs to be clear who owns what. In the case of ORCID, the author or contributor owns their own record, and that was one of the principles that was really important. And then who maintains it? Is it an organization? Is that organization going to be financially sustainable? Is the community sustainable? And finally, a kind of succession plan. I think it's never too early to be thinking about a succession plan because collaborations can lead to things that may not continue, and whatever has been created needs to be sustained. So that's it. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Okay.
Oh, here we go. Use presenter view. So I click presenter view.
It's in a loop. Just do it again.
Okay, and then how do I advance?
Just the arrow.
This right here?
Mhm.
Okay, great. So,
Okay, next up, we have Peg Fowler. She's the Director of Operations for Hypothesis, and she's going to talk about the Annotating All Knowledge project.
thanks, Pat. So let's see here. So as Pat mentioned, I'm the Director of Operations for Hypothesis. I'm standing in for Heather Staines, who probably a lot of you know, but she's not been able to figure out how to be in two places at the same time. So, you're stuck with me here today. For those of you who don't know about Hypothesis, we are a small 15-person nonprofit software development tech organization. I say we're headquartered in San Francisco because that's where our founder is located, but we're actually remote around the U.S. and Europe. And the organization was started in 2011 by Dan Whaley, who's the founder and CEO. For those of you who know Dan, he likes to take on big problems, and so the mission of the organization is to bring an open conversation over the entire web. So that's what we're trying to focus on. And in the process of doing that, we have developed an open source annotation tool, which is used today by many publishers, researchers, scholars, educators, and more. And actually checked this morning, and as of today, we have over 3.7 million annotations and about 150,000 users. So if you want to learn a little bit more about Hypothesis and our annotation tool, you can go to our website. It's very easy to get started. If you want to try out this open source annotation tool, all you do is click on the Get Started button, and you can install the Chrome device to your, or actually take the bookmarklet and put it into your browser of choice, and you can just get started. But what I'd like to do is spend the rest of the time today talking about the Annotating All Knowledge Coalition. We also call it the AAK. This is one example of a form of collaboration for the panel that we wanted to cover today. The AAK was started about 3.5 years ago with 40 founding members with the purpose of really creating a forum by which organizations that share a larger ecosystem would have the ability and a framework to work together to address issues and move the industry forward. And so if you take a look at the next slide, you'll see that as of today, we have actually 78 members from across a variety of organizations that represent this ecosystem. That includes publishers, university presses, scholarly societies, platforms like JSTOR, libraries, academic and research, and also other technology companies like Little Hypothesis, both in the for-profit and the nonprofit sector. And for those of you who have worn your glasses, you can see all the logos of the various organizations that are participating. You might wonder why Open Annotation as the framework for this Annotating All Knowledge Coalition. I won't read through the entire slide, but there are some key components that make Open Annotation a logical choice. Open Annotation and interoperable digital annotation enables access to content that is often stored behind paywalls and protected by proprietary systems. It also enables researchers and publishers to control their own data. And thirdly, with annotation, users have the option of creating what we call groups, and those groups can either be open or restricted, where one can collaborate, capture ideas, and essentially create an expert layer that lies over the original content on the web. Some other benefits, and I know others, Craig has talked about the importance of standards. Standards are very important in open annotation. We rely on the W3C annotation standard, which essentially provides a common framework and vocabulary for organizations across this ecosystem to share and to work with. The other thing is that the open annotation allows you not just to deal with PDFs, but you can work with a variety of formats, including HTML, EPUB, images, and other forms as well. Everything that is essentially you can find out on the web. So in terms of putting this large collaboration together, it was actually quite a bit of work that went into this. We probably spent about 6 to 8 months actually formulating the idea, who we thought might be interested in being part of this coalition, reaching out to them, creating a set of guiding principles that we could get organizations across this ecosystem to buy into, to agree to. And so you can see here that for the Annotating All Knowledge Coalition, essentially those principles were to be open, to be standards-based, support these key formats of HTML, PDF, EPUB, et cetera, interoperate and also support the notion of a clean page, letting readers choose which annotation layers that they wanted to lay in. So you can imagine, with those 40 founding organizations, just the logistics of meeting with them, going through the guiding principles, getting sign-off, having them in some cases take those principles back to others on their management team to then come back and say, yes, we want to be part of this effort. We think that this is something that's of value to us. So to pull off a collaboration of this kind, you really have to understand what you're taking on in terms of just the mechanics of going through that process. Once the 40 founding members came together, then we needed a mechanism, a way to steer the key initiatives. So we put together a steering committee that has a rotating attendance, I guess. And also we had to identify resources that we could actually put towards this coalition effort of moving this big body in this direction or moving this big body in that direction. And also put together a communications channel so that we could easily share information as new things were happening and occurring. And we were very fortunate to be able to piggyback on Force, their already built Force web portal. So we created something called an Annotating All Knowledge Working Group, where the members could go in, log into the portal, see calendars, look at meeting minutes, decks of presentations, projects that members were working on, upcoming events, and just all of those things that you want to be able to communicate to a large group of people that are not all in the same place. The other advantage of the coalition is it spawned what I would call experiments. So it enabled members to select each other out, find each other, and come together to essentially conduct experiments in open annotation. One in particular was with PaperHive and Hypothesis, and European PubMed Central trying to come together and figure out, okay, how can you actually do this? What does it look like? What's the end product? What are the things that we learned from this experiment so we can apply those lessons to other experiments going forward? And I would say in retrospect, just thinking about sort of project management best practices as being very applicable here. You're working with people who are in different organizations with their own internal agendas and other things that they have to do. And so, communication is absolutely key. You need to find individuals who are going to drive the collaboration for each one of those organizations, essentially scope the project so that you have boundaries around it and you understand what the beginning, the middle, and end is going to be, and specifically who's going to do what things. And then also establish a means, a mechanism to check in regularly, so whether that's conference calls or emails, whatever, so that the folks that are working on the collaboration can understand, okay, are we on task? Are we having problems? Is there something that we didn't anticipate? Is it taking us longer to get something done? And also, most importantly, at the end of the experiment or the collaboration project, whatever you want to call it, that you have the ability to do a post-project assessment. Was this worth our time? Was there a value add? Did we get what we hoped to get out of it? So really just thinking along those project management best practices and applying them to a collaboration can be very effective. So we've had some success stories coming out of this 3.5-year activity. We have an annual, Hypothesis hosts an annual I Annotate conference once a year, and many of the coalition members attend the conference where they can share the projects that they've been working on. And also we tack on a hack days so that the developers can actually get their hands into the projects and work collaboratively with each other on the things that they're trying to tackle. That's been a really great thing for us. Also, we have hosted coalition events specifically. So, for instance, last October, we gathered in Berlin. We had about 65 participants who came together, and they had an opportunity to share their projects at that time, and again, network with each other. Also have some breakout sessions and times to talk about things like FAIR, and just to make plans on how to extend collaborations that they'd like to be working on going forward. And most recently, in terms of the Open Science Initiative, we have actually started another community that is trying to tackle not only the things that Annotating All Knowledge has been working on in terms of technology, but understand that collaborations there's an interest for more than just the technology component, the data component to it. We had a 3-day workshop in the Bay Area at the end of August, and what we learned was there are many non-technical aspects where organizations can benefit from each other in terms of funding, sustainability opportunities, business practices associated with how do I run a nonprofit. And so there seems to be a real interest, especially within this open science framework, for organizations to be able to collaborate with each other going forward. And so we're very excited about that as well. And I have put up here we have a website for that, or a webpage, jros.org, so if you're interested in learning more about that collaboration, I encourage you to go check that out as well. And in terms of the Annotating All Knowledge Coalition, it is very easy to get involved if it's something that is of interest to you. Essentially, what we've asked people to do is to agree to these founding principles of sharing the vision of how this can benefit scholarship, exploring how to incorporate web annotations into your platform, publication, workflow, or community, and agreeing to collaborate openly with the others in the process of doing so. So I've put Heather's contact information here. As our Director of Partnerships, she would be happy to talk with you further about joining the coalition, or you can come find me, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for Peg? Nope. All right, I have a question for you all. Who is currently involved in some kind of collaboration? There's a few of you. Everyone here? How about in the past? How many of you have been involved in some kind of collaboration in the past? So a lot more. So I think it is something that happens in scholarly communication quite a bit. I thought my first question might be just to provoke some interesting discussion. What do you guys think would be the single most largest problem with collaborations? What do you think could really make a collaboration go south? Any ideas? Yeah, Anna?
Sure. So I would say, as I was saying, you really need to have a champion for a collaboration on each of the teams who really cares that it happens, cares that we're following the schedule for it, and is perhaps the task minder for it. You might have multiple people involved who play all of those roles, but if it's just an idea that someone had and you've started and you wonder, well, what's the status of that? That's probably an indicator. Put a champion in there.
Yes. No, I agree. I think a lot of people have very good intentions with the collaborations, and they find themselves overextended or in a place they didn't think they'd be with it. Anyone else?
Being sure that your management is on board with the collaboration, because that's obviously one of the common themes I saw was that everybody in the group has another job or has their real job to do, and when management isn't behind you, then it's awfully hard to justify the time you're putting into it.
Yeah. Anyone else? Great.
It's important that the key parties are aligned. I was involved with one collaboration that did not succeed, and it turned out that one of the key parties had their own ideas and sort of went off in a different direction. And this surfaced only 2 years into the project. So a little bit of a lesson learned there about trying to make sure that people are committed and don't have alternative plans.
Yes, we have a.
Hi, I'm Stephen Ringside. I have a question to pick up something that you said, Tony, which is authors are becoming more important in the ecosystem. The question is authors becoming more important in the ecosystem, and all of your work impinges on authors. So if I put myself in the position of an author, how's the collaboration? I mean, I've got all these new alternatives. I've got all these things happening. Perhaps you could talk a little bit, do all of you agree with Tony's statement? And maybe you could shed some light on how the world is looking from the author perspective.
So sure, I'm happy to start. So full disclosure, I work for a submission system vendor. So I have absolutely, I agree that being an author is more important, and not just because authors are the ones who've been asked to pay APCs, or at least to provide the information for someone who's going to be paying the APC. For us, it's been very important to make sure that the actual submission process itself has not only been revamped to make sure it's as user-friendly as possible and uses things like drag and drop, but also journals can have the option to do things like allow their authors to browse Google Drive or Dropbox for files and things like that. So I think that absolutely trying to make it as easy as possible for the author is something that organizations would fully say they support. But then if you look at the actual submission forms that journals require and the number of things that are on them, I would beg of them, review your submission form at the journal and make sure that you actually need to be collecting this information and when. So we've also had a lot of people who allow authors to submit a little bit of information first, and then if there's a chance that, yes, we're going to ask for a revised version of this paper, then when you submit your revision, we're asking for a lot more information rather than from the get-go before they have any chance. So I would say yes, there's a lot of lip service been paid to it, but I don't know that, certainly as vendors, we don't tell the journals what they should require on the submission form. They tell us what should be there, so it's a bit of a tightrope, I suppose.
And to build on that, we're listening to our customers primarily as to what we want, as to what they want built into systems like ours, and that's been probably the biggest request is how can we make this easier for the authors so they don't go somewhere else, and that has been part of what has driven us to do a lot of the technology that we are now producing that makes it easier for authors to do the submission and go through the submission process, and also to look at the preprint servers and say, okay, well, the author's already put their paper there, it'll be easier just to pull it down, okay, so the author's been rejected, let's try to help the sting of rejection by making it easier to move that paper to a different journal. We're driven to do those things by our customers who are the publishers and the journals.
I know a lot of this was about, MECA was talking about cascading models, but is there any talk about cross-publisher transfers?
Right, well, that is a big part of it, and because different publishers use, there are a lot of publishers who use all of the systems, and so that cross-publisher is important. And we had been approached over the years by various society publishers who want to form consortiums with other like societies, and they want to be able to pass papers back and forth as well.
Yeah, and so I would say absolutely. We work with a journal who allows 3 other organizations in their journals to send content to that journal from ours, and not all of those journals use our system. And then also included in that, and not necessarily required or tied to it, is an integration with bioRxiv. And we actually have people who on the submission form can answer a question and say, yes, please also submit this to bioRxiv as a preprint once I've submitted it to you. And we also have people who can send it from bioRxiv to some of our customer journals, and that's again up to the journal if they wanted to do that.
Question. Sorry. Yeah, I'm Debbie Sweet. I'm from Cell Press. I have a question that's kind of relevant to Letty's talk and is also relevant to the things we're discussing here. So you talked about open science and the open science sort of train, and I agree with you, it's a steam train. But it does feel like a steam train that's being driven by a vocal minority, or at least a vocal group of people, and to some extent by people who are not actually the researchers themselves doing the research sometimes. So it's relevant to what you're saying about authors. So I think I'm wondering, and when we speak to our authors, that the enthusiasm for the degree of openness that's being advocated in some places is not uniform, to put it mildly. So I'm wondering, first of all, Letty, what you think about that and how you're hearing from the actual research community as opposed to the funders, for instance, who are pushing it very hard. And then for you, we struggle with what we should ask authors to do, because we're trying to make it easier, but then we're also putting requirements. And how do we balance these things? And so you talked a lot about balance, so I'd be curious to hear from you. And also, all of your organizations deal with these things, so could you talk a bit about that, please?
Sure. You've got them.
No, hey, go ahead.
So I was just going to say very quickly that I think what you have to do is demonstrate the value when you're asking somebody to do something or extra work in their workflow. If you can demonstrate to them that there's something of value for them, then I think it's a more palatable ask. So that's just a quick aside for you.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and build also on what Craig said about the value of ORCIDs being different in different contexts, right? So you need to sell it differently. But to your point, as far as the demand for OA being uneven, it absolutely is. There are researcher groups that are absolutely, taking to the streets with this fury, that they're sure that they're toppling, the, establishment or whatever as part of the OA movement. And then there are fields that, just don't know. My teeny tiny information science program, 15, PhD cohorts, and I'm the only one who even knows what open access is. So, yes. Yeah, no, the knowledge is uneven. I think especially for, say, graduate students, and coming into the doctoral space, the training, the messages they're getting from faculty, are probably the most impactful, and from peers, of course. But, if faculty say, you need to deposit in an institutional repository, for instance, you need to make your data open, researchers are going to do it. We need to walk the walk to earn the, degree and the milestone or whatever that we're working for. So the messages from faculty are very uneven. So sometimes it's the funder agendas that are driving that train. Sometimes the researchers are absolutely, in the engine room. So it seems to vary regionally and by discipline has been my experience. But other thoughts?
So I would just kind of add to that as well. Whatever your message is, whether it's to authors about what you're requiring, why you're requiring it, having just one long page of author instructions does not seem to be likely to be necessarily read and or understood completely. So I would just say we've worked with people who've created videos for their authors. We've worked with people who've done what's called a guided tour where they click through and it kind of walks them through the submission form. We have people who have the full author instructions, have another short version of the author instructions, and I would personally say repeat yourself because, you know, our attention spans since the internet became our best thing, you know, is just really, you know, limited. So repeat yourself, be brief in places where you can, and don't think that one specific channel is it. You know, if you have people reading your author instructions or watching your author instructions who are from different generations and or don't speak the language your journal is published in as their first language, it might be worth making sure that you're really providing visuals as well.
Hi, Bert Corelli with TrendMD. I think it's worth acknowledging, after listening to these three different presentations, what a great contribution each of these organizations is making. You know, when you think about that they're bringing innovation, technological innovation, and solving problems, and coming from a place of really being sensitive to the stakeholders that are involved at every step of the way. And it's really interesting. I mean, for example, the MECA, you know, really started with bioarchives' need to have a way to transfer manuscripts because a preprint server wasn't an end state for the scholars. The papers needed to get published. So there was a business need that started there, but recruiting the other folks, I mean, from the platform providers that provide the technology and the publishers buy into the model of preprint, you know, and then on to publication. All of those things require a lot of you know, real consensus among people with very different agendas, and I'm caught up in, because I just finished reading this Evan Osnos article in the New Yorker about Facebook, and if any of you have read it, I think there's an alternate model that happens with innovation if you don't do what you guys have done, if you don't take into account the stakeholders. Technology can really be a disaster, and Facebook is a great example of how a disaster can come about through a technology that doesn't take into account the stakeholders. Anyway, just an observation if anybody else wants to comment on that.
Do we have time for, we're up?
Yeah, you're fine.
We're fine, okay, good. You had a question? Yeah.
So, just a microphone. I guess this remote collaborations.
So Neil Marriott from the Geological Society of London. So collaborations tend to come about or are successful where there is an external or environmental need which can't be met by any single actor or party. I guess one of the dangers is that you can come together and you can create a solution, but the solution is to the need of the time, and that as time goes by, the world out there evolves, and the need that you have satisfied also evolves, and there's a danger that the different contributors, different collaborators, potentially were able to agree on the original solution to the original problem, but the problem itself may change. And I just wonder if any of you have experience of how to ensure that collaborators stay together through changing times, and whether you have any experience of problems which have come about through that sort of situation, and how to avoid those problems happening.
Well, NISO has a great solution for that in that the working group can either evolve or change to an organization or a group that will continue looking at the problem and continue evolving the solution that was that we had all come together on. So I'm really excited about that process because I know working in technology, it's a moving target, and so that's one way that that's one good way to be sure that we keep our eye on how the requirement and the solution evolves to fit current or future situations. We're also involved in other collaborations, like, and the one I want to call out is JATS for reuse, or JATS 4R, which is also, it's a useful collaboration because it's looking at, okay, well, here's a great XML schema, JATS, that many of us like to adhere to and utilize, and how else can that be used in the future? And so that's another great collaboration that looks forward.
I agree with all of that. I would just like to add that I think your leadership is extremely important. Not only the visionary who started the thing in the first place, but if it's your working group, your steering committee, the individuals that represent the collaboration as a whole, with the understanding that, we're human beings. It's a dynamic arrangement. And so that's not the exception to the rule, that's to be expected. And so those individuals that are in the leadership role need to help drive the key initiatives that will address and move the collaboration forward, because it's not going to be static, it's going to be dynamic.
All right. Okay.
Thank you so much to our panelists. An engaging conversation with you all as well as attendees. So let's give them all a round of applause and thank them for their contribution.